good to be here again, and I want to express my thanks to this congregation for the many, many ways in which we share things. I have enjoyed every time that I've come here and appreciate the invitation. It has been great to get to know your pastor and his wife and watch them minister in this church. It's also nice to have my son-in-law and daughter and their 3 children in your care. You do a good job, and I appreciate it. My whole family does. A story. Once a movie theater made an offer of free tickets to the showing, only 3 days away, of a feature-length film that had been the talk of every moviegoer for months. The patrons of the theater, to say nothing of the larger crowd of occasional viewers, could not believe their ears. A premiere performance is an opportunity to make big money. Here, the tickets were free. The phones began to ring immediately at the theater office, but everyone was surprised to hear that the tickets would only be given out a few moments before the showing began. It took a little while for this to sink in. It wasn't possible for anyone to get a ticket in advance, but the whole town would want one. Everyone began to devise a plan to get the tickets they desired. But it soon became obvious to every thinking person that the only way anyone would get a ticket would be to arrive in the lineup, which was sure to be miles long, as early as possible. But this could take on major proportions. It was nothing for people to spend the night outside in a sleeping bag on the street just to get tickets to a concert or some other event. And those tickets were high-priced. These were free. And there would likely be no reserving tickets for family. If you wanted a ticket, and all the kids wanted them as much as their parents, they would need to be there. And it would be no use waiting until the night before. The streets would be lined with waiters by then, and most importantly, the theater only held 300 people. Now was the time to act. So the tents began to appear. Some brought only sleeping bags, but others virtually set up house on the street. Police were kept busy keeping it all on the sidewalk, and other shopkeepers who might have complained realized after all that they had a captive market outside their doors, so they set up their own tent outside their shop and did a land office business in the chaos while people bought everything they thought they needed. But it was hard to live this way for very long. And by the day of the showing, people were eyeing one another carefully and keeping children nearby. 1/2 hour before the showing, amidst highly audible murmuring as the moment drew near, the theater officials emerged with a book of tickets and walked into the street. As though royalty had just walked in, the entire street stood up, grew silent, and turned every head to watch their movement. The silence continued as the manager and assistants walked into the street, turned to the left, and began walking past the head of the line. Before long, they were halfway down the street, and the calls began to come. "Hey, what are you doing? We're the head of the line. Over here!" But the manager and entourage kept walking until they reached the end of the line, now around the corner and several blocks north. Here, a few stragglers had come at the last, if not for tickets, which clearly would be all gone, at least for the spectacle of the minor tent city that had sprung up around the theater. Carefully, the manager began to distribute the tickets, making sure that every person, small and great, got one. And very soon, the word went up the line. By the time it had reached the front, it was clear that those who had invested the least would get the tickets, and some would get none. And complaints were heard, and telephones began to ring. But all that could be done at the moment was to watch the parade of the least deserving, tickets in hand, marching to the theater with the theater manager at the head of the line. You have a lot of questions right now. And I'm not going to answer one of them. Instead, I want you to pay attention to your thoughts and your feelings about that story. You all identified with that story somewhere. You might have been at the head of the line, the end of the line, somewhere in the middle, or home thinking all those people were crazy. But what would you think and feel about the theater manager's action? Suppose it had been a lineup for surgery and not a movie. What would you say? You know, and you've already caught on to this, haven't you? Jesus gave a number of parables that sound just like this. They drive us crazy. Like the workers in the vineyard who all work for different periods but all get the same wages. My dad used to do labor negotiations for his plant. And whenever at church we preached this one, I can remember him saying, "That'll never work. That'll never work." He was right. Just bring up an idea like that in that kind of a context, and it'll never work. Likely neither will you. And Jesus comes to us fond of saying things like the first would be last and the last would be first, which is okay until it actually happens. Then it's not okay. That's bad and that's wrong. You can't do it that way. Our hearts cry out sooner or later. And that's precisely the point. In this world, you can't do it that way. So the world, if it is going to do it Jesus' way, will have to change. Think of it. What if we lived like that? But this is my point just now. Make no mistake about it. This is Jesus' way. It is a head-on collision with the way we do things and with the way things happen in the world. It is a completely different set of values. And it's an affront. It's a challenge. It makes you mad. It turns you upside down. And it is His intent, His prophecy, and His promise that His way will extend over all the earth. Do you think that might produce a little conflict? That is why my title says Suffering with God in a New World Order. Most of us think of suffering as something incidental. I cut my finger making the bed yesterday. Don't ask. It can be done. That's incidental suffering, and it happens to anyone. There will be someone who has lost a limb. Someone who has lost a loved one, lost far more than I have. And the way that we manage, the attitude and approach that we bring to suffering does have a witness component to it. It says something about me, my immediate reaction after I cut my finger. Whether I consider the whole world automatically unjust because I was making the bed and look what happened. Or I was living a good life and look how I'm sick. Or what I've lost, or something like that. It sort of tells us the kind of world we believe we're living in. But what about this world? That kind of suffering can be done as unto God. We saw that in the first night. It can bear witness as those values start to seep into us. But what about living in a world where people who have no connection with Christ and make no profession of allegiance nevertheless need to hear His gospel and see His way? What about a world that is being made new and really thought it was fine the way it was? What about the suffering that comes with people who are called not to hate that world, but to love it? To bear witness to it, not only by word, but by life? Who, it seems to me, inevitably will be the target of the resistance among many who just don't want to hear. Right now, the kingdom of Christ rules in his church, where people have already bowed the knee, and wherever the church can exert the real values of Christ. And I have to say, sometimes we get it wrong. But among his people, there is where you will get a hearing, and there is where the renewal is coming. There is where suffering is changing. But there is also where suffering is known as something connected with Christ. Here's where a witness is born to Christ's new way in a world order that is passing away. That's what St. Paul tells us. But the world order doesn't change easily. And so the sufferings of Christ continue. We saw that last week. Continue not in the sense of his death on the cross, which is completed, but in the sense of the bringing to birth of a whole new way of being and a whole new way of living based on that death lived out in his resurrection. His sufferings become ours on that account. And I want to represent this to you in three ways. First is the enduring value of Christ's suffering to us. The amazing announcement of the New Testament is that the cross is a triumph. The cross was no triumph to anyone before the gospel was proclaimed. It was, to say the least, the worst kind of failure. And yet, St. Paul says that in the cross, principalities and powers, the controlling forces of the world system that likes it the way it is, were all defeated. In the cross, they were defeated. The cross is victory. And therefore, it is the cross that is preached. So the mission is to preach, in that sense, the cross. That only as I am willing to become identified with that cross myself and allow it to do its work in me, and only as I'm able to live out a crucified life within the world with all the upside-down values that it brings, will I be able to understand what does it mean to be a Christian, what's the new world going to be like, and only in that way will I be able to bear witness. It's the cross that is central. No New Testament writer, certainly not St. Paul, is found saying, well, I'm glad that's over. The cross is a present reality to him. It is what he lives. In fact, there's a stiff contrast in the New Testament. In Matthew 16:22, Peter, prior to the resurrection and the gift of the Spirit, when he hears about the cross, says, Lord, this will never happen to you. Famous last words. St. Paul, after that, comes to the Corinthians and says to them, I determined to know nothing among you except this, Christ. And as though he were aware that it is very possible to say, well, let's talk about Christ, but let's leave that cross business behind. He says, nothing but Christ and him crucified. If you don't want to talk about Christ crucified, we're not having this conversation. If you want to have a conversation with me, it's Christ and him crucified. What a switch. It'll never happen to you to, this is what we talk about. It is therefore on the lips of every Christian from that day to this. And any time that our faith says to us, I'm glad Christ did all of the dying, we've missed the point in an enormous way. For the cross is front and center. We could say much more about this. In the book of Revelation, St. John the Divine, who sees the exalted Christ, sees him as the Lamb who was slain. It's as though you can see the living Christ still wounded. The cross and the resurrection are never separated. It reminds me of a friend of mine years ago with whom I worked in the same dairy where my dad did labor negotiations. This fellow went to church, but he had attended church on sort of a contractual basis. The contract went this way: I go to church and you bless me. Deal? He went to church and somebody stole the radio out of his car. He knew that I was going to be a minister. So boy, when he came back, he had a few things to say to me. I went to church and they stole my radio. Now, what have you got to say about that? So, and I hope this wasn't a cheap shot, I said to him, well, God sent his only son to earth and look what they did to him. And that was the end of that conversation. It sort of sets it up, doesn't it? What did I expect if I followed a crucified Savior? This does not mean that he shouldn't call the police and report the theft. But it does mean that his attitude towards life implied that it was all over and it was nothing but good for me and I could deal with God as though we were playing cards. But no way in the world was I going to be identified with a cross. Not even when it came down to my radio. I have before me here something else that is Anabaptist. You know about that, don't you? Is that word familiar here? Good. It's in our library. It's a front piece from an old book. And I'd be happy to show it to you afterwards. I don't want to take too much time with this. It's a book of prayers and hymns, and it says at the bottom of it, published in a year when it was most needed, implying that somehow this spiritual literature was really needed at this particular moment in time. That was 1720, so the Anabaptist movement is down the road a ways here. What intrigues me is, after it says that, there is a symbol in the center of it, a whole circle of skulls with bones in between them. And with at the top of each skull is a name like young, old, wife, husband, king, mayor. I think what is trying to be implied here is every person, every kind of person there is. And dead center in the middle of the circle it says this: human being, you have to die. We think that this was published at a time or in a place when death for an Anabaptist was no longer certain. And you know what happens? This has happened in the history of spirituality in the church many times. Knowing you're going to die for your faith remarkably straightens you up. When you don't know that you're going to die for your faith, something else has to enter in that causes the death of Christ to become a reality in a day-to-day life that isn't going to end shortly. Know what I'm saying? The cross was always intended to be that. At any time it's separated from us. We separate ourselves from Christ's suffering in the present. Whenever we separate ourselves from Christ's suffering, we separate ourselves from Christ. We don't know him. There's something about him that we can't tell. And that's why in Philippians 3, Paul says, I want to know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, as though they are ongoing, and as though there is something about Christ that will never be known if we are constantly trying to avoid his sufferings. He becomes a stranger to us. And do you know something? We then become dangerous. Honestly, brothers and sisters, we become dangerous. If you're unwilling to accept his sufferings, you will inflict it on someone else, or you will stand by coldly and watch while somebody else hurts. And you won't do a thing. This is terrible, but it is also true. As we've seen, this is no mere identification with a suffering past. It is a representation of suffering in the present. Christ's suffering as the New World Order emerges, and it emerges only with difficulty. Here are a few of our connections with his suffering as found in Scripture. First of all, it says in Romans 8 that we groan inwardly, awaiting the redemption of our bodies. As though the suffering is something that we carry within ourselves so that physically we can feel it. And if we will allow Christ to work it in us, it points us, first of all, towards the suffering of others, and secondly, it points us towards the day when redemption of those bodies will come and there will be no more pain. The renewal of all things begins with a renewal of God's people. And we, far from just accepting things as they are, groan as sufferers who know it will not always be like this, and await our own renewal. It is the bondage to death that all of you feel, and all of you try to cover, as I do, and work with, day to day. And it is the bondage to death that science attempts to overcome with futility, which has a theological and spiritual message to us. One day this will be over, but right now let it do its work. And let the groaning be for something real instead of just a complaint that as you get old you can't see so well. Let it register within the soul as a groaning unto God for a much larger creation. Immediately after that verse is the discussion of the whole creation groaning. You are part of that. There's no setting you free without setting the creation free. There's no setting you free without redemption of many others. Secondly, we struggle outwardly with our own entanglement with the world. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4 holds this startling expression: in your struggle against sin, you have not yet come to the point of shedding your blood. Try to imagine what would that look like. But I can understand in their day far more easily than in mine. It was quite possible to be placed in a situation in the New Testament times where if you didn't capitulate to the existing spiritual values of the day, you could literally be attacked. And if you resist, it will mean the shedding of your blood. And as we've already seen, that is not unknown in your spiritual heritage. That's exactly what he's saying. The Hebrews are people who are coming to the point of saying, is this really worth it? And the author says in that verse, you haven't even really tried yet, because there's a step you haven't shortened up, where it would actually shed your blood to say no to sin. That's suffering. That's struggle. And all of you know it. One of the things that agonizes you more than any other thing is that you're still the way you are. But that temper against which you fight and struggle is still, it can be present with you. It's your temptation to lust, to covet, or to ignore, to walk away in coldness. It doesn't take much to bring it back. Our suffering is realizing that has no part in us and no part of Christ. Oh Lord, it's not that I did it, I didn't do it, it's that it's still there. Purify me. It's a well-kept secret in our circles today, but not in God's circle, that sin and our complicity in it should not only be a struggle, but it should incur life-threatening opposition from time to time. Lots of God's people still know that. In the third case, we're also called to suffering as a part of our call to Christ, and this must also be known. We're startled to hear, for instance, in Philippians 1:29, that suffering is a gift that we share. It's been granted unto us to share in His sufferings. Excuse me? Thank you very much, but I'd like to send this one back. No. It is part of the gift of our salvation to be given to share with Him in His sufferings, in fellowship and in union with Christ. This is not a gift we send back. This is one we receive with knowing thankfulness. Christ includes us in His life and cannot leave anything that important out so that we may know Him. St. Paul, when he was in the process of being called to serve Christ, received a ministry from a man named Ananias. And Ananias, when he received the commission to go to Paul and lay hands on him and pray for him that he might receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, said, Lord, do you have any idea the kind of serious damage this man can do to me? And God's answer was remarkable. I want you to go and show him how much suffering he will have to undergo for me. Thank you very much. Paul was well acquainted with suffering going in one direction, and Ananias' message was, the gift that's coming to you will bring the suffering home the other direction. And for St. Paul to take that up, you hear it over and over and over again in his letters, the things that he suffered. And you could swear somebody written him a check. That he was in fellowship with Christ and knew that. And this suffering was an emblem of it. He glowed with the knowledge. What a turnaround in the way we think. In Philippians 3:1 we get that, and in 1 Corinthians 1:5 it speaks of the sufferings, our sufferings as the overflow of Christ's. And so it reiterates that we share that. And as if to seal this, if we pursue a godly life, 2 Timothy 3:12 affirms that we will suffer, and it is specific in that account, we will suffer persecution. And so the two main sources of suffering in this age for Christians are either the sharing of the sufferings of Christ as he works through the gospel to renew the world, or the sharing of the sufferings of those who hate him and will hate anyone who names his name and who seeks to live after him. But I can't end here. For suffering is not forever. In Revelation 21, that beautiful expression is found. And the Lord will wipe away every tear from their eyes. As though in the omnipotence of God and the salvation of Christ and the new world order that he is going to bring, there is enough power to erase all of the pain. I don't know what that will be like, but I have a feeling he will give it to his people to minister to others. And in that new world order in which everyone sees the righteous reign and rule of God through his Son, wounds will be healed. Anybody who feels like they're a healer in their heart will already know a little bit about what that new reign will look like. The Lord himself will wipe away all tears. I'd like to relate this to you again in story form, because sometimes a story is helpful to capture an image and carry it with you. And besides, it's getting a little late. There was once a woman who, together with her entire family and her whole town, were sufferers from a debilitating disease. It took life away bit by bit, so that she, only 24 years old, looked twice her age. Few lived to what we would call old. But one day she fell in love with a soldier. She did not tell him, and for more than the usual reasons. He told her about her life and the suffering of her people. Most importantly, he told her that if she would just wash in water, she would start to recover. If she washed everything in water, she would become completely whole. In fact, anyone who cared to do this simple thing would be made whole. This is what he told her. The woman wondered at what he had said, but she was sad then to hear him say, I must go off to a great battle, but I will return. Remember what I said. Wash with water and you will be made well. The woman returned to her home. She was in love with the soldier, but as in many previous times, she gave no room for her feelings. All was consumed in the disease. Yet she thought, wash with water. How does he mean? And without even deciding to do so, she found herself at the river about to wade in. The next day, she got up to discover that she felt better and could work. She did that whole day and lay down at night tired but very happy. The next day she arose, but felt tired and wondered if the previous day was a dream. She went to the river again, and this time she emerged to the stares of some onlookers who were not used to seeing someone, especially a sick person, behaving this way. But she could not deny that every time she bathed, she grew stronger. And she noticed something else, something that made her for a time cover her head. The signs of the disease were disappearing from her face. She was growing younger day by day. If she failed to bathe, the tiredness reemerged in any one of a dozen ways, but when she bathed, she went from strength to strength. The woman one day brought home water and washed food, and that day was even stronger. She invited in some children and fed them, and they changed from their listless selves to activity that startled her. It had been a long time since any children in the town had acted like children. By nightfall, they had faded to exhaustion, but she had learned what she wanted to know. The next day, she toiled dawn to dusk, carrying water to the house. For days after that, she did so, using the evening darkness until she had washed everything that she could touch in her home. Clothing, tools, pots, walls, nothing escaped her attention. And she began to grow even stronger and fresher in both appearance and power. Well, such developments were not lost on others, but they kept silent, not caring to spend much energy in seeking out one solitary woman. But that was before the day that she appeared at the center of town in the market one day at noon. When everyone was present, she began to tell them in her loudest voice what the soldier had told her and what she had been experiencing. For a few moments, she seemed like a diversion, and some stopped to listen. But most drifted off as the sun grew hot and their strength failed. The next day, she thought, I'll bring water with me and I'll show them what I found. The crowd was a little apprehensive when they saw beside the woman a large pot of water. She evidently considered herself more than just a diversion, but they were utterly unprepared for her invitation to come and wash. What, here? The joke had gone too far. People who are sick struggle to find humor, and this crowd was no exception. They walked off jeering, except for a few who came closer to look and see if it was just water that she was carrying. Just water, she cried, and offered to wipe a brow or two. One young boy who'd lost his parents agreed to let her wipe his brow. Nothing happened as she did, and he walked away, while the hangers-on made fun. He did not dare to tell her that as she had wet his brow, the joke had gone too far. People who are sick struggle to find humor, and this crowd was no exception. They walked off jeering, except for a few who came closer to look and see if it was just water that she was carrying. Just water, she cried, and offered to wipe a brow or two. One young boy who'd lost his parents agreed to let her wipe his brow. Nothing happened as she did, and he walked away, while the hangers-on made fun. He did not dare to tell her that as she had wet his brow, a 3-day headache had eased and disappeared. But the woman persisted in the market every day, which was quite a feat in addition to her drawing of water, washing, and the chores of life. The people had expected her to disappear, but she did not. Several of them listened to her, and a few could be seen at the river with her. They learned to go in the early morning before others came in order to escape harassment. But as surely as she said, they began, one by one, to recover. Now there were several who spoke of the water, and others began to get annoyed at the persistent message. They began to talk among themselves, devising explanations about conspiracies that would account for the effect of the water. And every night, the woman remembered the soldier who had told her of the water in the first place, and her love grew. She alone had kept the secret of his return. But those who opposed her drove her from the market until she could only call, she and her handful who had watched with her, from the hill that overlooked the town. The cry was always the same: "Wash with water, and you shall be clean." One day, however, the woman, together with her small crowd of followers, walked boldly into town. The people were about to stop her by force if necessary, until it became clear that she had not come to speak or even to stop in the market. She continued through town right to the bridge that crossed the river at the town's only entrance. Her clear determination caused many to follow, even though they thought her a crank. But she stood at the entrance of the bridge and pointed off into the distance to the right, where a small cloud of dust could be seen, rising up in the distance. "He's coming," she cried. "The soldier who told me about the water, he is returning from the great battle. It is him that you must meet. He will tell you." And with a glow that silenced all, whether believers or scoffers, she waited breathless and aware of nothing else than the approach of the victor. Can you capture that moment when everyone lifts their eyes to see the one who's coming? And can you capture his arrival and the look on her face? And if you can you capture along with that the meaning of all of the suffering? First of all, the personal suffering and the cleansing and removal of it in her life. Secondly, the suffering for his sake and for his message, that is now transformed into one encounter when every eye will see him. Can you capture that? Well, that's the church, and you know who the soldier is. And that's where the suffering goes, if in fact we are in fellowship with him. For as we bear his message, we bear the struggle of that battle, but we also bear the victory in our bodies. And as surely as we stand here, we'll be redeemed. And as surely as we preach the gospel, so will every other person who believes. And even those who don't will see him. And in his return will come his redemption. Do you think you could suffer with Christ just for that moment? Just for that day? Just to be there, not as one who says, "I told you so," but as one who says, "One more time, just look. Just look. He comes." Because if you can, I suspect you know something about the fellowship of his sufferings already. Let's pray. Mighty Jesus, you who have suffered, you who were obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, you who suffer even now, unwilling that any should perish, you who have committed unto us the ministry of reconciliation. Mighty Jesus, precious, sweet, healing, renewing, restoring Jesus, who one day will make all things new and wipe away every tear. Come and make us new, and come and make yourself known to us, that even now, our very lives would, in the fellowship of your sufferings, bear witness to your victory. Amen.